everyone, and welcome to this lesson on the China coin. Now this video is going to be aimed at students looking at their area of study of belonging and are also looking at Year 12 English ESL. Now this video today is going to be split into 3 parts, and each part is really going to help you develop your understanding about this text and really help you to write essays and create arguments surrounding what you've read. So when we're considering understanding your text, it's very important that you have a very thorough outline of the text as a whole. So you're not just understanding it in broad detail, but really understanding it specifically. So if we look at these steps to understanding your text, you'll see that the first of these is understanding the plot summary. The second is having an understanding of the author, who they were, and what motivated them to write this story. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at the historical context surrounding this work. So what are the kind of historical, cultural and social influences which really have shaped this work and which you really have to understand in order to understand the plot and the characters. We're also going to have a look at an analysis of techniques, so really picking apart the language so you can use those specific examples in your essays. Also examining some belonging themes and ideas. And finally looking at reviews and critical opinions, which you can use just to extend your own reading of this text. So let's begin by looking at a plot summary. Now obviously when you're reading a text, you don't just stop and understanding what happened in the plot, especially once you're at a Year 12 level. However, it's really important that you have a really solid knowledge of everything that happens and how it chronologically sort of pans out, just so that the rest of the different steps become a bit easier to analyse. So let's take a look at this plot summary. The basis of the story is that Leah's father dies of cancer, and therefore her mother decides that she wants to recapture her Chinese identity through a trip to China. So that's really the premise of this work, this trip to China which they're going to be undertaking as a family. Leah is from Chatswood and doesn't want to go to China as she feels very Australian. She doesn't really identify with that Chinese culture that her mother does, and she doesn't really understand why her mother is so desperate to go on this trip. Her mother is prompted by the mystery of a half coin. Now this is a coin which has been a sort of a relic, sort of passed down through their family, and it's an ancient family heirloom and also a mystery. So something which the mother really wants to solve and get to the bottom of. What is this half coin? Why is there only half of it, and what does it mean for their family? So they fly into Guangzhou and they immediately feel quite left out, basically because Leah doesn't speak Chinese, specifically Cantonese. So early on you get that sense of displacement. Leah's in this new environment and she really just doesn't understand the things that are happening around her. She doesn't speak the language, she's feeling disconnected therefore from the people. So you really get that sense early on in the plot that this is going to be a story about someone who perhaps doesn't belong, but then goes on that search to find belonging. Joan, who's Leah's mother, enjoys the live market, for example, but Leah really hates this culture and she doesn't understand it. For example, we get scenes which involve chickens being kept in small cages and Leah not supporting that. Or we get scenes of the eel which is being taken straight from the tank to be eaten in the restaurant. And these are things that the mother really enjoys, but that Leah doesn't understand, so she's very isolated in this environment. They actually then go on to travel to a village where they seek out Joan's family. And basically what happens is because Leah doesn't have the last name of Joan's family, she obviously has her father's last name, she really doesn't feel that sense of connection to her extended family, which her mother does. So again, we're getting that sense of lack of connection and displacement. She's really not feeling that sense of belonging. Leah, however, is slowly becoming more interested. For example, she visits the ancestral grounds and is really coming to terms with what this culture means. So it's a gradual shift for her, but one which is definitely leading to belonging increasing for her. Leah meets a distant relative who's a cousin, and his name is Ke, and he's actually a student protester. So this is where we really get in the basis for most of the novel. This concept of the student protests which were occurring, which obviously later led to the Tiananmen Square incident, which we'll be looking at in more detail, and that happens at the end of the novel. So they instantly become friends, and eventually Kay actually kisses Lee. So we're actually leading to this growing friendship between the characters and developing that sense of belonging which people can share with each other. Kay gives Leah the two halves of the coin blown into a glass egg. So we're really, as the story is progressing, solving that mystery of the coin, and Kay is just sort of the way of Leah coming to an understanding about what that coin means for her family. They actually then go to Beijing and they witness the Tiananmen Square Massacre. So obviously that's an extremely large event in Chinese history, and one which in just a moment we're going to be looking at in some historical detail. Leah and her mother are trapped in the hotel under martial law. So basically what this means is that they're being held by the government and sort of by the military within the hotel, and sort of denied as Westerner status the ability to see this event. So they're trapped inside the hotel. However, Kay goes missing and is assumed to be dead. So that's obviously the really tragic element of this story. And it's what's giving you that message that, freedom is really important, and the sort of opinions of these protesters really have to be considered. At this point in the novel, you get Leah reassessing her values. So she's really growing up as a person, she's maturing, and she decides to forgive her mother. She realizes that she actually is part Chinese, she sees that identity in herself, and is also interested in the problems and the protests facing China. So she really develops that awareness, that sense of how important this message is for her family and for her as an individual. Importantly, at the end, when she's greeted welcome home on the plane, what she actually realises that Australia isn't her only home, and that she also has that home and that sense of belonging in China. So she's now sort of got that dual sense of belonging to both cultures, which is something which has developed as the novel's progressed. So now let's take a look at the author, Alan Bailey. Now, basically, when you're studying a book, it's so important that you have an understanding of the way in which the author's background has influenced the construction of a text. And sort of those different factors which perhaps really persuaded the author in the first place to write down and sort of write about these events and influence you through his work. So, he was born on the 29th of January, 1943 in Scotland. He then moved to Australia at the age of 7, and he then moved between the towns of Emerald and Geelong in Victoria. So these, Emerald's a smaller town and Geelong's a larger coastal town, so you get that sense that he's moving around a lot in his childhood, and perhaps needing to continually find belonging in different environments. He studied journalism at the University of Melbourne. He's also a very extensive traveller, so he really has a lot of experience with different cultures, and that's something which would have shaped him to produce this work, The China Coin, obviously exploring the Chinese culture which he's experienced as a traveller, and which has really inspired him to produce these works. He writes both children's and adults' books, so he really gets that range within his repertoire of works which he's producing for his audiences. Now we're going to examine the way in which you can understand your text. So it's not just about knowing the plot, but it's really about dissecting the different layers of the text to have a really complete understanding of what the text is about. So as we've discussed, you must know the background of your text to truly understand it. So we're going to be taking a look at those sort of different background influences on the work. The contextual understanding is actually going to make reading and analysis a lot easier. If you understand sort of historical factors and the basic events which are mentioned in this book, you're going to have a lot more of an easy time when it actually comes to analysis of techniques, themes, and sort of belonging ideas. So understanding the background is going to help you. Once you have this basis, we're going to be examining the text in more detail. So this is just an introduction to the text at this point. So if we take a look at this quote, which is actually by the author, you'll see the way in which he was really personally influenced to produce this text. So, the slaughter of Tiananmen Square had begun. The China coin had changed radically, and I had to rewrite it 8 times to control my anger. So you really get that sense here that the author has been personally influenced by this event to the extent that he's emotionally stirred up about it. He's rewriting these texts over and over again so that it really expresses how awful these events were. So it's obviously really important that you have an understanding of what these events were and what really influenced Alan Bailey to produce these works. So let's have a look at the Tiananmen Square protests. So basically, these protests were a series of demonstrations and protests that were in Tiananmen Square, which is an area of Beijing. And these began on the 15th of April, 1989. The aims of these protests were to create continued economic reform. Obviously, China, coming out of that very communist period of its history, was now moving towards a capitalist economic system. You also had the demands for freedom of the press, so the idea that journalists should be able to write truthfully and openly about what was occurring, and things like censorship shouldn't exist. Freedom for the people in general, so those sort of basic democratic rights which the Chinese people were really pushing for. An increase in education levels and the quality of education which people in China could access. So now let's take a look at the causes of these events. So basically what happened is the death of Hu Yaobang, who was the general of the Communist Party, really stirred up this frenzy, because what happened was that no longer were people so subservient to the party, but they really saw a way out, an opportunity to express their opinions, to really get their opinions across not only to their government, but to the rest of the world through the scale of the protests which they were trying to produce. We're also looking at an inflation in the market economy, and basically that was just making life more difficult for the people as a whole. Political corruption was a problem widely in the government, and the people really wanted to stand up against this and make sure that their system was just and fair, and that this sort of corruption in politics wasn't going to really be affecting their everyday life anymore. There were also limited career prospects for the students, and that's something that the students really wanted to deal with through these protests. So make sure that the education they were getting at later high school and university could be applied through jobs which would really challenge them as intellectuals. We're also looking at the issue of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, obviously, once this had occurred, the prospect that communism might be over forever in China also became a lot more realistic. So the people were acting out on this and hoping that there was a way out. So obviously the consequences of this massacre was that martial law was declared, as we saw in the China coin when Leah and Jonah stuck in the hotel under martial law and can't get out. We also have the People's Liberation Army, who walked through the city using open fire to clear the protesters. So we really have that sense that this was a really violent, a really awful event, which was a very sort of black area in Chinese history. The death toll of this event is actually unknown, basically because records kept by different people don't really match up. And the decision of the Chinese government to sort of not hide this event but keep it quite down low meant that it's quite difficult to understand complete statistics about what occurred. So it's probably between anywhere between the hundreds and the 100,000s. The government figure suggests that 241 people died, and then on top of that there were a number of injuries. However, figures by the Soviet Union suggest that perhaps it was 10,000 people who died. We also have the figure of NATO, which suggests that 4,000 people died. So there's a lot of variety in the statistics about what actually happened that day, and we're really getting a bit of discrepancy about what occurred. This image here is actually quite famous in discussing this event and really picturing this event for the rest of the world. Now, this image is a depiction of what has become to be known as Tank Man. Basically, this protest was mainly consisting of students and young people, but it later included sort of more normal urban workers and other more ordinary people like that. Basically, these protests were a way for them to rebel against the government. So really speak out against all these problems which they saw in their society and try to make an effort to influence their own futures. So this picture of Tank Man is showing a man who actually stood in front of the tanks and demanded to speak to the soldiers. So obviously a very courageous act, and one which is very obviously standing up against this government and sort of symbolising freedom and democracy. So he was actually removed and remains a symbol of rebellion, even though no one actually knows who he was and what happened to him. Interestingly, he was actually named on the list of Time's 100 most influential people of the 20th century. So that's really an indication of just how powerful he was, not only acting as a symbol of this rebellion, but really catching the rest of the world's attention and drawing awareness to this historical issue. So this brings us to the end of part 1 of this 3-part video on the China coin. We've already discussed plot summary, a bit about the author, and this historical and cultural background. And now we have an understanding of this. You can join us in just a minute to look at the text in more detail.